Hello everyone, and thank you all for being here. My name is Jenna, and I am an immunologist, which means I study the system in the body that's responsible for fighting disease. I want to begin by asking you a question. Is having two diseases worse than having one? We're going to take a poll. Please raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. Okay. Now please raise your hand if you think the answer might be no. Okay, some mixed reactions, we're not sure, because it's hard to know, right? Well, historically, many immunologists probably would agree with the first group, operating under the assumption that diseases have an additive effect. The more harmful microbes present in the body, the more the immune system has to multitask. And for many diseases, this is absolutely true. But if I've learned anything in the years studying the immune system, it's that it has an exception for every rule. But before we can begin to wrap our heads around two diseases together, we first need to understand how the body responds to any single infection. I want you to recall the last time you got sick. What kinds of symptoms did you experience? Maybe a fever, a sore throat, feeling a little achy. Well, none of those symptoms are actually caused by the bug that's infecting you. They're all signs of your immune system at work. And scientists like me try to understand if it's doing its job effectively and if there's anything we can do to help it be better. In healthy people, the immune system must maintain a very fine balance. On the one hand, you have inflammatory cells that leap into action, yelling, "Everybody panic!" And on the other side, you have regulatory cells that turn down the dial and say, "It's okay, stay calm." If you have too much regulation, you can't generate a strong immune response, and therefore you can't fight the infection. On the other hand, if you don't have enough regulation, you can't control that inflammatory response. I study this phenomenon in malaria, which is a parasitic disease that is transmitted by mosquitoes. Over half the world's population is at risk for contracting malaria, and most cases are found in Africa, but it's also widely found throughout Southeast Asia and South and Central America. The parasites that cause malaria are called Plasmodium, and they infect red blood cells. And they cause those cells to express proteins on their surface that make them sticky. They're kind of like burrs that you find on your clothing after hiking. These infected cells stick on to the inside of your blood vessels and accumulate in your vessels' outside organs like your lungs and your brain. The parasites never directly infect these tissues, but that doesn't mean they're safe from the immune response. To picture it better, I want you to imagine that your organs are a medieval castle with immune cell soldiers stationed around the perimeter. When the parasites sneak in and begin climbing those castle walls, the soldiers mobilize. They get their catapults. But because they're aiming at an enemy that's already so close to home, some of those boulders break right through the castle walls. Friendly fire. It's this kind of immune activity that actually causes many of the severe complications you see in severe malaria. What's interesting is that not everyone who becomes infected gets this overly aggressive response. And the science community isn't actually sure why some people have too much of a response and why some don't. There are many factors that can affect the strength of the immune system, ranging from your genetics to your environment to your health history. My research focuses on just this one branch, which is what happens when you have multiple infections in the body at the same time. This area of health research is actually quite understudied because most scientific studies, including those that we use to make vaccines and new medicines, are performed in highly sterile labs that attempt to isolate the microbe of interest and remove outside influence as much as possible. It's clean, it's controlled, and it's absolutely necessary in order order to understand the disease properly. But it's not real life. In the real world, we are exposed to tens of thousands of microbes every single day. Some of them already live inside you, while others you may come into contact with while moving about the world. Not all of these microbes are bad, but some of them can become dangerous if your immune system can't dedicate the appropriate attention to it. In the case of malaria, it's these opportunistic infections that are detrimental. And we've already identified quite a few different microbes that are worse in malaria patients, even if that patient's malaria symptoms are actually quite mild. But in the course of my research, I actually stumbled upon something that was a little bit unusual and different from what we see with these. We were investigating what happens if you combine malaria and the flu, because despite both of these being major global infections, we don't know what happens if we put these two together. This is because for decades, people thought flu didn't exist in Africa, which is where most malaria cases occur. Turns out, it definitely is there. We just weren't testing for it. So to understand better what these infections were doing together, we designed an experiment where we infected mice with malaria on its own or simultaneously with influenza. The mice with malaria only succumb pretty quickly to that organ damage that I described earlier. What's curious though is that when I brought flu and malaria together, the mice lived. 100% survival rate. We thought maybe the parasites just didn't properly infect the mice, that something about the flu was preventing them from establishing the infection. But when we looked at the blood of each group, we saw no difference in the parasite burden. So if these mice aren't controlling the infection better, why are these mice surviving? Well, remember, what kills most people with malaria is too much inflammation. So we suspected that by adding the flu infection, we were somehow tipping this immune balance back in the right direction. To test that, we looked at what immune cells were present and responding in flu. And we did find a population of cells that we thought were regulatory, the stay calm side of the immune system. And these were only present when flu was also present. But just because these cells are here in small quantities doesn't actually mean they're doing anything. So to check how effective they were, we put them in the scientific equivalent of a boxing ring. When we culture inflammatory cells in the lab and trick them into thinking that there's an infection present, you can see them respond really strongly. When we pit those inflammatory cells against the cells that we get from our flu infection, however, we can see that the inflammation is completely halted. The regulatory cells are the ones that win out. So we still can't be sure, based on this artificial setup, that the flu cells are actually what's driving our phenotype. We can see that it's preventing this severe disease, but we don't know if they're working alone. So we asked, what happens if we get rid of these cells? If they're truly the ones responsible, then when we take these cells away, our mice will no longer survive. So to test this, we found a drug called gemcitabine, which essentially prevents these regulatory cells from being produced. And when we gave the mice this drug, shortly after infecting them with malaria and flu, we indeed saw that these mice no longer survived. In other words, these cells were absolutely necessary in order to see protection. Together, this data showed that the flu wasn't helping cure the parasitic infection. Rather, it was boosting the regulatory branch of the immune system, and thus helping protect the body from this overzealous inflammatory response that's characteristic of malaria. So that's cool and all, but why do we care? Because if malaria and flu are better together, then we don't need to worry about them, right? We can focus on the other co-infections that are bad. That might be the case, though there's still a lot more research to be done. But I think there's more to take away from this that reaches beyond just this specific infection.
Sorry, can we ask questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Does the flu vaccine boost the regulatory cells also? And if so, would the flu vaccine
So that's something that we're actively investigating right now. In people, we don't know yet if the flu vaccine is able to induce these cells, but that's something that we're trying to do in our mouse models right now, and it gets a little bit actually towards the next part of my talk.
We'll have a FAQ at the end.
Oh, okay.
I want you to take a second and imagine that you guys have just come down with the common cold. It's pretty typical. Some people get it every year. But this one's hitting you a little more than usual, and that cough's getting pretty bad. So you decide to finally go see the doctor, see if they can give you anything to help. That doctor runs a blood test, and they say, "Thank goodness you came in. This cold has an 80% chance of killing you. But don't worry, there is good news. If you take this medicine, you have a 50% chance of survival." I don't think any of us would actually be happy with those odds, would we? This is the reality that malaria patients have to face every single day. But the difference is they might have to walk for several miles in the heat and humidity in order to hear this news. In 2023, over 600,000 people died from malaria, and that's actually an improvement compared to decades prior. So do our current medicines just not work? Well, not exactly. The antimalarial drugs we use today work great to kill the parasites that cause malaria. But as we learned, the reason people die is because there's too much inflammation, which current medicines do nothing to target. And actually, the immune system is pretty bad at telling the difference between live parasites and dead ones. So you still end up with a lot of inflammation even after receiving treatment. What we really need is therapies that calm down that inflammatory side or boost the regulatory side, which can be given in conjunction with current antimalarial drugs. So the answer must be that we just infect everyone with flu if they show up to the hospital with malaria, right? Probably not. Especially because my research shows that not all strains of flu actually induce this protective phenotype. Instead, we're trying to take our knowledge from these naturally induced pathways and find drugs that give us the same effect. But that's a lot easier said than done, because the immune system is really complicated, and designing therapies that are both powerful but safe is really hard. The answer, luckily, isn't necessarily to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from the expert. Our immune system has evolved over billions of years, and it's developed some pretty good things. It's not perfect, but if we can understand those systems and take them and use them effectively, then we can design some really good treatments. Sometimes the key to treating one disease just lies in finding the unexpected behavior of a different disease. Thank you, and I would be happy to take any